Hi, everyone. Hi, nice to see everybody. It's nice to have a full house, and we have one more coming in. Nice to see everyone. I'm Di Kilgore. I am with the Cultural Council of Manchester by the Sea, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all once again to this distinguished speaker series. The series has had 3 prior speakers. Hi, Katja. The speaker's wife delivering water. The series has 3 other speakers, all of whom are distinguished. We have one more after Mr. Wisner tonight. And he is such a fascinating man. We are lucky to have him at this very sensitive time in our cultural zeitgeist. We have wars that feel as though they're percolating. We have political problems that seem to be consuming us. And one of the pleasures of reading this book, The Conscious Art of the Art of Conscious Conversation, is that it is a thoughtful book. It is challenging to read, although it's only 188 pages. What is dynamic about this book is that it brings all of us to a place of not only questioning the value of the communications we have and understanding our friends think in a different mindset, but perhaps before we start difficult conversations, we need to ask ourselves, are we so locked into a frame of reference we can't think beyond ourselves? It is a comfort to read, it is a challenge to read, and it's, I think, time well spent because of the value of asking, how can this book, this small book, bring us together? And having read it and reread it, I feel as though I have learned from it, and I thank the author very much. The author has worn many hats in his life. He was a professional musician, so you know how musicians think, you know, out there a lot, right? Drummer. He's out there, and so he also took that skill set and applied it to architecture, which was another accomplishment in his life. He became a professional architect in the Boston area. I'll let you include that. And that too brought challenges in communication. He had a challenging work environment, and you would think that it's fairly linear, but of course our dialogues are never linear. They're always shades of complications because we bring our own perspective to things. And so Chuck has found a way to meet with the minds. He's gone on to be a mentor and an advocate for people in Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 200 companies, including Tesla and Ford. And those opportunities are in this book, in that the fundamentals of speaking to people in the corporate offices, in the C-suites, are just as challenging because they bring family problems with them, interpersonal dynamics with them, and then Chuck, through a series of very easy to understand platforms, explains how to approach tricky conversations. And first, he recommends we get in touch with ourselves. One of the most important ways he blended this for me, if you choose words of importance when you're reading, one of the words I found to be of particular gravitas was parte. Am I saying that correctly?
Parti.
Parti. And the parti to architects is a, do you want to explain?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Is the concept of understanding that the fundamentals of building something are many and varied, and the expression you used was to get into the weeds. But then to parti with an architect is to go up here and understand there's an umbrella concept, that we can at least understand the bigger picture. And so with that, I ask you to start the party with our speaker tonight and understand that we are going to look at the big picture, and then if you choose to ask questions, there are greater details in the book, and I think that Chuck is probably a better person to explain the details rather than I. So on with the party, my friend.
Okay.
Okay.
And so, as conversations go, feel free to interrupt and ask questions.
Well, my husband's filming this. Does that occur at home as well?
And I'd love to save time so that we can have a conversation and you can ask questions, because some of this might be new to you all. So do you hear? Speak louder. Yeah. So the mic is for the recording. So I will speak louder. In fact, I'm going to stand up.
You may do well to bring the mic closer if you could.
Yeah. Well, the mic isn't doing the room. Yeah. Let me just take this out of here if I can manage to do that. There we go. So when I'm standing, I need to have this because of those rascals. So what I'd like to do is just give you a quick context of how this all fits together and why it matters to me so much. As Diane mentioned, I was an architect in Boston for 20 years, and not early, but somewhere in that career, 10 years in, one of the partners was an alcoholic. And when we were a small group of guys doing architecture, that wasn't a problem. We were having parties together. But when we grew to a larger firm that had employees and important clients, he became a problem. And we smart architects didn't know what to do with a people problem, so we hired in help. We burned through 2 useless consultants. I might say they were men. And then we hired a woman who came in and did magic. And the way she interviewed us, the way she had us in conversation, the things she reflected back, and helped us manage through this so that we all came out in the end with a better understanding and a solution to the problem that not everyone was happy, but it allowed us to move forward in a good way. To me, what she did felt like magic. And it just inspired, it just got my curiosity going, and we became friends, and we started doing some teaching in the building industry around conflict, because she had these tools, and I knew the building industry. So one thing led to another, and literally I did mediation training at the Harvard Law School, and some other trainings, the ontology of language, and 4 years later, I was so taken by what I was learning and how much it changed my life that I left the partnership in architecture and I started a whole new career at the age of 41. My wife is better with timing, but something like that. So this work really had a huge impact on my life. And I ended up writing the book because after working with clients for 25, 30 years, they would all say, this is great stuff, but how do we connect the dots? And so that's what I tried to do in the book. And it's not an academic book. I tried to keep it simple and applicable and easy to use, but it has a lot of interesting things that made a difference to me. So let me have a few slides, very few slides, but I want to use them to sort of frame my conversation. So this is a quote by Aristotle. Aristotle just fell down. Will you be my Vanna White?
I'm Vanna White for the night.
So, Aristotle, the ultimate value... Okay, stand still.
Oh, thank you.
The ultimate value of life depends upon awareness and the power of contemplation rather than upon mere survival. And why this rings true for me is because we actually grow up in conversations adopting patterns from our families and our cultures. And those patterns become really natural and easy for us because we just adopt them without thinking about them. And so often, we aren't taught the ABCs or the DNA of conversations, but we're just acting out the things we adopted. So Aristotle say contemplate. We're not talking about contemplating our navels or anything like that, but it's like let's reflect, let's investigate and learn about them so that we can actually not be an autopilot, but we can actually be more productive, more aware, and hopefully more connected. So I like to think about the how, what, and why of conversations. So we all have a bad conversation. We can hang these back up, dear.
Hold on. Okay.
But we can hang them back up. I don't think they'll fall again.
Okay.
Let's try that. So we all, I'm sure many of you have had, in the last week, a difficult, frustrating, disappointing conversation with a family member, grocery store clerk, and a direct report, your boss, and we all go, how can I do that differently? And we all think about that and we talk about that. The problem is that because we're doing these patterns that we adopted, we don't know how to make those changes. And so the what is about, what are conversations made of? If we take them apart, if we do a little bit of investigation, what are they made of? And so I'm going to do a little bit of that tonight, which is the foundation of the book, breaking it down into different types of conversations. And that's critical, but also the why is really important. And the why is, why bother? Because it is the one common tool we have as humans to connect, to solve problems, to co-create, to collaborate action, to make promises. And we do it day in and day out, but often without as much wisdom and knowledge as we could. Make sense? So the why is the inspiration to have the courage to look at the what and the how. So the book is organized around 4 types of conversations. There are 4 distinct types of conversations: stories, collaborative conversations, creative conversations, and commitment conversations. Now, why they're important? I had a teacher, his name was Rafael Echeverria, and he would say to us, if I took you to Alaska for 6 months and we lived with the Inuits, they have some, it's very controversial, they have some 20 to 35 names for snow. And if we lived there with them and learned their names for snow, when we came back to New England, we would never see snow the same way again. Because now we have names, and we have visuals, and we have pictures to put with those names, and our whole relationship to snow changes because we have a distinction about, oh, that's great snow called, I wish I could pull up an Inuit name, but that snow is called X because that's good for igloo building. Right? So those distinctions change what we see, what we hear, and how we listen to the world. So language is like that. If we have new distinctions to understand conversations, we can see them, we can hear them, we can listen differently, and we can communicate differently. So the 4 conversations are a first distinction to say, if we understood these different types, even if you leave tonight and you just remember 4 types of conversations, you will never be as innocent as you were when you walked in. So beware. And then the 4 types of conversations are universal. I work with these in business all the time. They happen in our families. It's not like specific to a kind of business or a kind of conversation or communication. They're what we live in every day, day in and day out, and we slide in and out of these unconsciously because we don't have the distinction. Now, each one of these, there's a theme underneath. And the theme underneath, I'm going to flip this up, this is another distinction, and I promise these are the only ones I'm going to give you. There are 4 archetypal elements that thread through each type of conversation. So whether you're storytelling, or you're collaborating, or you're making a promise to someone, these 4 elements are always in the background of our mind, often not conscious on our part. When we bring them to our consciousness, it helps us sort of dissect our own thinking, investigate our own thinking, and it helps us communicate with others in a much more effective way. They're a real shortcut. If you're stuck sometime, you say, why am I upset? Why am I triggered? Why am I this? Why am I that? Frustrated. If you would ask yourself these questions, you will learn something about yourself that is probably hidden in the background of your consciousness. And that information is like golden nuggets so that you can actually transform your thinking and then transform a conversation. So, concerns, every conversation we have, you have a concern about tomorrow. You don't want tomorrow or next week to be as tough as today was. Or whatever happened today, you don't want it to happen again next week. I think about our phone calls that our kids would call us at 1 a.m. about trouble they were in or something they were doing, right? And that just sets off the concern bells and the worries, and you go into action because you don't want it to happen again. So concerns are everywhere. Unfortunately, like many of these, all of these, they live in the background. And the idea is just by investigating, or as Aristotle said, contemplating, you can bring them forth and learn from them. So concerns are big, they're future-oriented. Every conversation you have, there are authority issues. Issues of power. Doesn't matter if it's you and your children, you and your spouse, you and your boss, you and your direct reports, you and your friends. There's authority issues. Even at a friendship level, a friend could say, "You look terrible today." And one friend might say that to me, and I would just go, "Oh, you're so full of it," and just brush it off. Another friend might say that, and I'll go, I wonder, maybe I do look bad. What's going on here, And then I might ask them, like, what do you think? Because I'm giving their voice authority, right? And this notion of authority is embedded in every conversation you have, unconsciously. So bringing it to the forefront helps us to navigate the power issues. One advice I always give executives when they're saying, how do I tell, I may be talking to a VP or something, how do I tell the CEO that he's a jerk? Well, I say, first of all, what are you concerned about? And they say, well, the project shouldn't be doing this, we should be doing that. And I say, well, whatever conversation you have, don't usurp his authority. Don't go in and say, you're doing the wrong thing. Because immediately he's going to get defensive because he has power. He might be a leader that doesn't understand conversations and doesn't understand the power of his words. And there will be consequences for you. So the notion with that person would be to say, I have a concern. It's your decision. Give him his authority. But here's my thinking. I think that if we go down this road, these are my concerns and what the consequences might be. And that is a very different approach than walking in and going, you know what? You're making the wrong decision, and I have a totally different idea, but I know you don't want to listen to it, right? So authority is really, really big time. Desires. Every judgment you have or every opinion you have, there's probably an unrecognized or at least not spoken out loud desire that you have. Desires are a good thing. They're goals. They help us get to where we want to go and do what we need to do. But ultimately, if they don't line up with reality, they get us in trouble. So a desire that you want something to happen, but it's not lined up with facts or reality, then you're out of step and you're going to suffer. So desires are a good thing, but being aware of the ones that get you in trouble, the ones that trip you up, are really, really crucial to not getting stressed out and having them turn you into a stressful human being. They're good, but they have a trap. And the last one is one of my favorites because they're just ubiquitous, they're everywhere. Every opinion you have, every judgment you have, there's a standard of why you're making that judgment. And where do your standards come from? Anybody have an idea where you get them? Parents. Yep. Parents, culture, school, experience. But our standards, and standards is a broad category. It means our morals, what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, what we like, what we don't like, what a good dad is, what a bad dad is. All those things are standards that we hold, but they're way in the background of our consciousness often. And I've resolved many conflicts just by having two people put their standards on the table. Well, I think it should be this way because this is how I measure success. And the other person says, no, I think it should be this way. And then once they talk that out and they get on the table, they're not blaming each other, they're saying, here are my standards. They start hearing each other in a new way. And they start listening, and things happen. That's the magic of mediation. Right? So standards are everywhere. I used to work with groups of women, and I think I can say this. I used to work with groups of women, and so I'm checking my standards here. When we were talking about standards, I'd say, okay, so ladies, women, how many of you feel badly if all the beds in the house aren't made when you leave in the morning? Or when, the day is starting? Anyone raise their hand? Anyway, this was probably 10 years ago, but I would always get in the confidential sort of work that I do and the nice community that we had, people would raise their hands. And I would ask, so where did that come from? And, the answer was my aunt, my grandmother, my mother, our culture, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those standards. But if you're operating on autopilot and just living them out, and by the way, you go to work and the beds aren't made, and you feel bad all day, but you're beating yourself up all day because you didn't make the damn thing, that's not a healthy way to live, or a healthy way to treat yourself. So these live in each conversation. I'm going to stop and say, you have a question? You have a comment? I'm going to take a drink of water while you think.
Well, I've got a few pages dog-eared here, but one of the reasons I started to feel cozy with the book was because you started with something we can all relate to, a fight with your wife. I especially liked that because the Kilgore house has rocked a few times. The fight is over, a dynamic that I think we've all experienced. There's a misunderstanding of the goal. Chuck's wife wanted to attend something as much as you did, a party you were both looking forward to. And Kati got ready, as women do, as best she could, and it took a little longer than Chuck's 10-minute drill of, I took my shower. And so I love that dynamic because guys tend to have the same frame of reference women do, and yet we experience that time in very different explanations of what the goal was the same, but the transitions were different. And so it caused problems in your house, and it's I think, an example of something that we can all relate to. It's very practical, and it speaks to the human experience. This is the humanity of how we live with each other. So it caused trouble until you realized you needed to bring a dialogue to what was really happening. And I liked your breakdown, if you could go through that.
Well, so Katja's right here. She's not happy
Thank
about
you,
this
Katja.
story.
I'm with you. Go, girl.
But she wasn't happy about the story. But in the end, the story was about me. The story is about what lesson I learned. Because, so we've been married 42 years. And we still have a great time with each other. The story was that I would get very impatient when we were late for an event. Because, I would come in from the garden and just take a quick shower, put a new t-shirt on, and be ready and waiting in the car, like tapping my foot. Where in the hell is she? And so we would be off to the party, and there'd be tension in the car. And then, I don't know, I can't even remember what sparked it after many fights. I said, well, this isn't worth very much. And then I sort of did my own contemplation, my own reflection. What's going on for me? What are my desires? Well, I like to be on time. What are my concerns? We can't seem to do that. I don't want that to happen anymore. What are my standards? Well, I realized that the world according to Chuck was you needed 10 minutes to get ready. That was my standard. And so why in the hell would she need 40 minutes to get ready? Right? And so that was on me. I wasn't blaming Kata. I had to learn that, oh, wait a minute, my standard is, the world doesn't operate according to me. And so that was a big shift. And now that conversation is fun for us, and we can kid around and we can give each other a hard time. But that's a good example of standards and me sort of not taking a power issue and saying it has to be my way. Right? So how are we doing on time? I'm going to do a really quick thing on the 4 conversations. So storytelling. Storytelling is an amazing conversation. We thrive on stories. We, as a society, as sapiens, I don't know if you're familiar with Yuval Harari's book called Sapiens, but in that book he talks about what happened in history when sapiens sort of did a leapfrog of progress as a group of humans forming societies. And the turning point was when their brains developed to the point that they could tell stories. And they could make up myths. And because of those myths and those stories, many more people could congregate and create a society, or create more than a tribe, a larger society. And that was a huge turning point. So stories are our only way of sort of teaching, learning, connecting. When we have cocktail parties, we're connecting via stories, and we use them everywhere. The trouble is they have a downside. And the downside is that stories are traps for us as individuals. We have a part of our brain that is just story making. It takes in so many billions of bits of information at one time, and based on our history and based on our experience, it delivers to us, it connects all the dots and go, oh, this is what's happening. And then we have that story. That's okay. It keeps us from having to create the world every day. We don't have to figure out how to go to work. We don't have to figure out how to tie our shoes. We don't have to figure out how to drive a car, because we have all that automatic stuff. But when we have stories, so they're all helpful, But when we have stories that harm us, then we aren't doing our work, right? And what happens is our ego gets attached, our identity gets attached to our story, and then we hold our story as the truth. And our story isn't the truth. Our story is has our emotions in it, has facts in it, and has our opinions in it, but they're not the truth. And what the analogy I like is, if I go into a conversation with my story or my perspective about what something should be happening or what should be happening or about a particular event, and I go in with a closed fist, that's me saying my story is the story. And then guess what? If you have a fist and you meet my fist, we're in a fight. Right? So the work around stories is using the CADs, the little monkeys in your brain, to take your stories apart and to investigate them. What am I concerned about, like I did with Kata? What am I concerned about? What are my standards? What power issues? And all those things. And then what that does, just asking yourself those simple questions, that opens your hand. Now I can come into a conversation with you. We might disagree, but I'm willing to share my thinking under my story. I'm not just coming in like, I'm right, you're wrong, right? And that's the work we have to do individually. And so there's a lot in there. They're just every day. We live in this soup. But doing that little bit of work on ourselves prepares us for the next conversation, which is collaborative conversation. And the collaborative conversation is when two minds come together or multiple minds come together and they actually are collaborating, meaning they hear and they can learn from each other and create together. But what that means is each person in the collaborative conversation has to be ready to do that, right? So a collaborative conversation is a melding, like thinking coming together from multiple people. We've all experienced, it's a lovely thing when we aren't in conflict, but we're saying, wow, I never thought of it that way. Oh, those are your standards? That makes me think differently now. Let's talk about that. I never thought of it that way. So collaborative conversation is very tricky, and the two tools are advocacy and inquiry. And what's interesting about them is we're never taught how to do them well, we're taught how to do them badly. So we're taught how to be advocates to prove our point. We're taught to raise our hands in school when we have the answer, right? And I'm not saying we shouldn't have answers. We all need experts. We all need to be smart. But if we are carrying our position and advocating just to prove our point is right, that is why we don't listen. That's why we can't take in other people's information. We can't absorb their position because we're doing this. So open advocacy is saying, let's all practice saying, I have a position, but here's my thinking underneath, right? And that changes the dynamic. It's one way that mediation works, is you get people to sort of reveal more and more and more about their thinking so that things can sort of, that tension can diffuse. Same is true for inquiry. Many of us aren't taught how to ask good questions. Our questions are inquisitory. Our questions are to prove they're wrong and you're right, right? So what would open inquiry be? Open inquiry is even if I'm in a conversation with someone and I'm there trying to say, here's how I'm thinking, I'm vulnerable, I'm being humble, but they're like tight-fisted, what can I do? Do open inquiry and ask some questions. Tell me what you're concerned about. Get them to go a little underneath. And if they won't do that, say, well, here's how I'm measuring whether this is going well or not. How are you thinking about measuring it? What are your standards for success? And those questions, what you're doing is you're slowly prying someone's hand open, You know, you're sort of like, come on, give me more. Tell me about your thinking, not just your position. And that's open inquiry. And that's a dance. That's a real dance of, I can't give you a formula. It's like say, oh, advocate first, and then inquire, and then advocate, and then advocate, and then inquire. It's a dance you have to really be paying attention to. Should you be asking questions, or should you be offering your thinking? So that's the real art, the real skill. It takes a little time, but what happens when we collaborate like that, in a room full of people that are really having a good mutual learning conversation, magic happens because ideas start bubbling up. And why? Because minds are synchronizing, hearts are opening, and ideas can flow in that space. We've all experienced that, where we're in a conversation and all of a sudden I have one idea, they have another idea, and we're locked in, but we keep talking, we dialogue, and all of a sudden, oh, wow, I never thought of this, we can do it that way, and a new idea bubbles up. And that's sort of the beginning of the creative conversation. These two go together, the collaborative and the creative. The creative conversation is also about trusting our intuition. We are so left brain focused. We are so rational, literally focused, that we forget that we have a right brain, which actually has a lot to offer. You know, when we can relax, trust our intuition, allow ourselves to imagine possibilities instead of being stuck on one idea, what's possible? You know, that is allowing yourself to be in that creative space. It takes some work, but it's very rewarding because that openness, that every conversation of storytelling, collaborative, and then creative, they're like an opening of your mind. They keep expanding your mind a bit. And then ideas come, and ultimately, though, it has to collapse back to a point because now we have to make a decision. And that's what the commitment conversation is. Okay, we've had these ideas, we have possibilities, what are we going to do? And we live in commitment conversations every day. We make promises to our kids, we make promises to our friends, we make promises at work. But unfortunately, because we don't know how that conversation works, we do it badly. We make promises sloppily. And there's one main reason: we are addicted to yes. I can't tell you the number of business situations where people get in a bad spot because a bad promise was made. Someone runs by your desk and says, hey, can you get me some slides ready for Monday morning meeting? The person sitting there says, sure, no problem. Promise made. The guy that says, sure, no problem, works the whole weekend putting a deck of 30 slides together, gives them to his boss on Monday morning, or sends them to his boss on Monday morning. She looks through them, and she goes, oh, these are awful. This is not what I wanted, right? And now she doesn't trust him. She barks at him. He's like saying, I spent my whole weekend doing this. You know why it happened? Because he just didn't ask a few questions. What do you want? Who's it for? What does good look like? What format do you want? Who asked for it? All right. So each promise we make has those components of time and success and who's it for and the tone of how it's asked. So they're very complicated conversations, and there's a recipe of how they work. Because ultimately, if you make a good commitment conversation and you clarify a request and you make a good promise and it fulfilled, what does that do? That's how trust is built. You make a sloppy promise and it's not fulfilled, that's what distrust. That's the root of distrust, right? So paying attention to that conversation in small things, who's doing the dishes? My wife and I would joke about, you know, she likes to go to bed after a party like a maid, meaning she'll clean up the whole kitchen and likes to wake up like a queen. I'm just the opposite. I like to go to bed like a king, and wake up like a servant, you know? So, but instead of that being a point of tension, we get to play with it. We get to laugh at each other, or we get to take turns. She usually wins. But the notion of not having those small things, which are based on our standards, create bad promises and expectations and distrust is crucial. Right? So there's one more element. When we put all these together, we realize, and this is something I've learned in business, it's a term I created, and it's called the conversational bypass. And what the bypass is, we love our stories. So we love our own story. We love to tell our story. Whether it's a family meeting or a business meeting, there's lots of stories brought to the table. Many, many stories. Many, many perspectives. We also love the action conversation, which is a commitment conversation. Because that's where we're saying, okay, who's doing what, by when, who's cooking what, who's making the decision. We love those two conversations. But guess what? What's happening if we go from story to commitment? What are we missing? The other two conversations. Collaboration and the creative conversation. The two juiciest ones for dialogue and learning from each other and co-creating together get skipped. So I call that the conversational bypass. Because we go from storytelling to commitment. In business, it's like some perspectives get told, and maybe the boss or the person with the loudest voice says, okay, what are we going to do? And then we're off and running. We make a decision. The decision isn't well vetted, and we probably make less wise decisions than we could. So that's the bypass. So I'll wrap it up so we have some questions. So go back to Aristotle. The reason to understand conversations in a new way, so we can contemplate them, we can learn from them, we can change ourselves, how we show up in conversations, and we can bridge conflicts and learn to laugh and take life a little lighter. It's made a huge difference in my life, from career changes to how I raised my children, to my marriage, to my family. And I hope if you take anything else, just remember there's 4 conversations, and remember the CADs. You know, the CADs didn't make it into the book because my agent hated acronyms. So, but he's not here, so I get to. You know, but remember that, because even if you find yourself getting triggered, just take a minute and ask yourself those 4 questions. Now, there's inside of all this are our emotions, there's facts, and there's all those things that we can sort of take apart to use to understand ourselves better. But that's, we just couldn't dive into everything today. So, you have something you want to add?
I have a few things, sure.
Yeah.
On page 88, I was particularly taken with the word addiction. We are addicted to having the answer. And I think that's part of our culture as Americans. We all want to be available to each other. If someone asks you a question, you would like to provide the answer. In Chuck's wisdom, because it's based in a lot of places, you take a riff on Plato, and then you take a riff on the Buddha, and say, let me sit with that a minute. And so rather than having the impulse to be a person of addiction and give an answer, I think this goes back to your previous example. Perhaps just asking a few more questions,
right.
Developing a dialogue rather than the diatribe of, sure, I've got it. I thought you revisited that point multiple times throughout this book, and sitting with it takes some time. And I like that you bring pause to the reader. Perhaps you should rethink. Perhaps you should be more with the Buddha or Plato and say, someone is having a bad time. Perhaps I could understand a little bit more about them. So you bring a lot of humanity into the transcripts. There's a section about a parent and child having difficulty, and they both think that neither understands where the connection really is. And through Chuck's scholarship, and probably because he's a musician and brings the rhythm into a story and brings architecture into the story, I thought you have a very nice platform for bringing a working relationship, an equation into how do we get to a resolution that works not just for one, the authority figure, not for the other, but for both. And I think that the book has a pacing to it that is respectful of our other side, our right side, of understanding there's more to our relationships than just a linear perspective.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Questions? Thoughts? Yeah.
Fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, I'm curious about how sensory autism
Mm-hmm.
where you're not understanding the topic necessarily, or you're having two different conversations and not realizing it.
Yeah, so
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
So how does that work into?
Right. There's many of those
Yes.
deficits, but if you think of autism, we know so much more now about that because of neuroscience, and you know the what's it called when you have different. No, people that were not say I'm normal, but they're not. But that's not. It's like neurotypical or neurodiverse. Yeah. So when we understand more about that, right? Because then we become more empathetic of what that person is capable of. And in fact, for autism, mostly it's and I have some relatives that suffer that have or live that way. And but have been trained out, right? But they had these deficiencies where they couldn't read emotions, right? And they couldn't put the words and the emotions together. But you can actually do some training to help them see what they can't see and hear what they can't hear. And then diversity, I don't know, I would even go further and say, you know, in my work with corporations, there's many, many more bad leaders out there that don't have a goddamn clue about the power of their words and how to communicate than there are good. You know, and that's just because they were never trained and they get all the power and they make a lot of money because they're smart and they're experts, but then all of a sudden they're leaders of 20 or 100 people, or I have clients that have 9,000 clients, you know, that if they don't really pay attention to the power of their words, everybody suffers. Other questions? Hello.
So I think we all imagine that we come into a conversation being collaborative.
Yes.
But do you have any suggestions if you realize you're dealing with somebody who is intransigent?
Yeah.
How do you, how can you give us some advice on how we deal with that?
Did that ever happen around the Thanksgiving table? Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. And, you know, I have an answer that probably might not hear anywhere else is, I think when you run into that situation, you have a couple choices. You can try to ask good questions, and I've been in these situations. You can try to ask good questions, and you pay attention to what you're getting back, which is more intransigence, right? You can suggest that you change the topic because you don't think the conversation has any value or it's not going to go anywhere. People will get defensive often when you do that. Oh, you don't want to hear me out? You don't want to listen to my point of view, right? But our other option is our own boundaries. Our other option is to say, you know what, I just don't want to be part of this. And you don't have to engage. You can just choose not to engage. Thank you very much for coming. Interest in your thoughts. Your thoughts are interesting. And I'm going to go get a glass of wine. But that's a conscious choice to set your own boundaries and to do it that way. It reminds me of another trick I have or I teach, where if a negative judgment is coming at you, it's sort of similar vein, but not quite, maybe not political, but a negative judgment is coming at you, we basically have a few choices. Our habit, our automatic pilot, is to let that go in. Let that judgment sink into our mind and our heart. And I like to call it a poison dart. And I like to say, you know what? If you have the presence of mind, catch the dart. Catch it before it goes in. And then when you have it in your hand, then you have choices. Once it goes in, you're screwed. You know, you think the chemicals start flowing in your body and you're upset and you're frustrated. But if you can catch it, then you can give it back. Hey, I think this belongs to you. If you want to give their voice authority, you might say, I think this belongs to you. And, I'm interested in understanding why you think that way. But there might be people you want to give it back, and you don't give a damn whether you understand them or not. Authority issue. And the third option you have is just catch it and throw it to the gods. Just get it out of your system and go get a glass of wine. Right. Questions? And thank you, Tony. Other questions? No? I think the biggest challenge is the bypass, the conversational bypass, where we tell each other stories and then we get to action. And that goes hand in hand with people not knowing how to openly advocate and inquire and have true collaborative conversations. Yeah. And then leadership on top of that, because the leader's voice has so much power. And most leaders aren't aware of how much. I have leaders I worked with that are passionate, smart, caring, and they hire me to say, why won't my team engage with me? Well, because he gets in front of a room of 10 or 12 people and starts drawing pictures, and this is what we have to do, and I'm so excited, and let's do it, let's go for it. He's the boss, he's the vice president, and he says, well, what do you think, team? And they're all like crickets. Right? Because he just railroads over them. And I'm saying that because it's not his fault. It is his fault, he's not aware. And so I get to beat him up a little bit. But it's also their fault because they're giving his voice all the power, which then diminishes their voice. Right? So it's a two-way street. It's a great question, yeah. And the other thing I'd say, in general, one thing we can do besides learning some of the distinctions, and just start listening to the different conversations or listening to your own concerns and standards, is I think we can counter our training around advocating by asking better questions, by falling in love with questions. Anytime you're in a conflict, just stop, don't defend, just go, tell me why you think that way. And when we show that kind of vulnerability and some humbleness, that's sort of contagious. People want to be invited into that space. Right? So if we can fall in love with questions, that's a great first step. Thank you. Yeah, wrap it up.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. This is a wonderful, obviously, opportunity for us to speak more affectionately to each other and more productively with each other. If you'd like to speak with Chuck, he has books for sales, or if you'd like to ask a question that's a little less public, I think he'll be available for a few more minutes, and I thank you, and I hope you'll join us next month when our other neighbor, Ron Skates, will be joining us to explain probably as best he can, the nuances of AI, which apparently control all of us willingly or unwillingly.
So
thank you.
I do have some books. They're $20, and I think whatever I sell, I'll give to the Cultural Center. So.
Well, that's awfully nice of you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.